Hammer space. Noun. From hammer and space. Referring to the large mallets often produced from nowhere by cartoon characters. One of the cool things about playing PC games is learning about the developer cheats. They're commands that the devs put into their games as a means of testing and debugging. The most well-known cheat in PC shooters is no clip. This untethers a player from the game world and allows them to explore a given level without having to respect the in-game gravity or collision with surfaces. When I did some of the fancier looking shots of my passing thoughts for Ravenholm, I used no-clip to simulate the effect of a camera dollying forward down the passage leading to the forbidden mining town. It's fun to no-clip in some games and look at how the devs laid out the level, and where they emphasized details and where they left stuff out, because the player wouldn't normally be able to see those sections. Just be careful, because you could end up in situations that upset the game and cause a soft lock. You're probably wondering, hey, I know this already. Why are you going on about no clipping? Well, what if you played a game where no clipping was its only mechanic? Hammerspace is a first-person non-shooter by 4 devs during the 2020 7-day FPS Challenge Game Jam. It's set in what's ostensibly an unfinished first-person shooter from 1997. The game's aesthetic definitely seems inspired by Quake, with all of the drab brown walls and grimy metal doors. The operative word in that description is ostensibly. This game feels like it's the product of a game jam. This game is short. It's really only 3 levels and they're all shorter than any Quake map. Just like when I covered I Want You to Notice Me, I'm going to ask you to play Hammerspace before watching this video. I provided a link to the game's itch page in this video's description. I like this game because it's wrapped up in layers of metatextual humor. It's a send-up to designing a game and all of the pitfalls that it could entail. There's this idea that emergent play can't ever happen in video games, because everything that's in the game was placed there intentionally by the developer. It's like the watchmaker theory, but for game design. I've never agreed with that concept. There are so many examples of things happening in games outside of any designer's intent that have been acknowledged and celebrated. A developer's bug becomes known to a player base, who then use that bug as an exploit in order to optimize their playtimes, and a competitive scene flourishes as a result. Boom, we got speedrunning. The animations in a certain fighting game have a priority order for certain types of attacks over others, and players learn this hierarchy and form orders of operations in order to chain attacks in rapid succession while leaving out any room for their opponents to respond. Boom. We got combos from Street Fighter. Don't worry, the irony is not lost on me that I'm talking about how emergent play happens outside of developer intentions in a video about a game that's intentionally imitating a bug-ridden project. Anyways, Hammerspace. I love how it begins without any fanfare. It feels exactly like dropping into a new session of Quake. The game does a great job of selling the idea that it really is just like any other FPS. The text on the walls indicate that the game is starting off in the tutorial area. From the get-go, we learn how to move like we're in a standard FPS, and how to jump like we're in a standard FPS. Hey, what's that over there? Scattered throughout the game are comments that the dev team left almost like post-its in the game world that refer to the surrounding area. This is a really great narrative device. I have never tooled around in a game engine before. I've never made my own levels, but I don't think that developers need to place these kinds of nodes into their maps to communicate with each other. They can just, talk directly to each other. These nodes are obviously here for the player's benefit, so that they can draw inferences from the level design and the comments about what happened behind the scenes. I don't think it's a coincidence that these comment nodes look very similar to the developer commentary nodes that Valve puts in all of its games. Unlike Hammerspace, those commentary nodes are placed in those maps specifically for the player's benefit to understand the creative process when building those games.
Project Lil is our code name for an internal push to make our comments more accessible to the whole Valve community.
It turns out that this message was placed at the bottom of this pit because testers didn't know they could double jump. The level came before the message, and the message is a response to the level, and now we can form a chronology in relation to the level design and the comments. Just like we can draw inferences as explained earlier, we can also infer that this game was in development during 1997 based on the timestamps attached to each comment node. These jumping tutorials serve a couple purposes. On a surface level, they teach the player how movement works in the game and how the physics should feel to the player. The player can't run and his hops are short and shallow. This is our baseline for the rest of the game's experience. On a metatextual level, these tutorials exist at the beginning of this game because most games, as a general matter, feature tutorials at the starting level. We as players are accustomed to seeing these kinds of messages at the beginning of most games, and the inclusion of these messages adds to the authenticity of Hammerspace's conceit. When the player passes his blind corner after learning about air control, the view at the end of the next room shows that another tutorial message is plastered on the wall at the far end. Looks like it says mouse butt. Oh hey, a comment node. Yeah, I really like this game's sense of humor. The next room looks like it should provide the player with weapons, but, something's off. The comment node provides context for what happened with the weapons. It's another case of dev humor. This time it's about futzing around with the naming conventions for objects. Also, I love that the placeholder error model is meant to refer to the same kind of placeholder object in Source Engine games when the actual model can't be found. Well, this sucks. We got no weapons, and there are already enemies around the corner. These guys are rough. All hit scanners, and they snap to the player's position as soon as they're alerted. Hey, what's going on with that wall? I don't think the game's supposed to do this.
Yes, it is.
I don't know how they did this, but the devs did a great job recreating that ghosting effect that happens if you go out of bounds and the game has to render back faces. It's not as aggressive as it would be if you were to do this in Half-Life, and it's definitely more stable than actually no clipping. Looks like the devs left the dummy room off to the far side. This room contains 2 jump pads that are locked behind a red and blue lock, and 5 soldier models who don't aggro towards the player and are stuck T-posing. They also track the player's position, which can be a little unsettling. 2 of the soldiers are carrying the red and blue keys needed to unlock the jump pads. But I think we were all drawn to the giant, untextured sledgehammer at the center of the room and framed by the spotlight that doesn't seem to be attached to any actual light source. I really like the layout of this room. It looks like an altar in a Zelda game, and we just found the key item for the dungeon. Reaching the commentary node, placed at the top of the room, requires a player to use a hammer on at least one of the soldiers. Hitting them causes them to distort like Paul Rudd in that one Tim and Eric skit. The node tells the player that the hammer was dummied out of the game because it wouldn't work with the level geometry properly, and would actually cause rifts where the player can go out of bounds. Now it's time to play the game. When you hit any surface with a hammer, it causes a rift to open up that you can pass through. Wherever a rift is open, there'll be a small square floor tile for you to stand on to avoid falling into the void of untextured game space. Now we can take out these soldiers and press on with our new toy. Before leaving the level, pay attention to the adjacent wall. Although it looks like the same shade of gray that covers the early parts of the level, it's actually the placeholder textures for the game's engine. This opening level is such a perfect encapsulation of Hammerspace's premise. This looks like an unfinished level, but every element is deliberately placed to set the tone or tell the story. The second level expands on the premise and adds some more details to the hammer's gimmick. The error object at the base of this pit was supposed to be a jump pad, but a programmer's poor spelling has rendered it useless. However, the dev comments seem to suggest that the team was actually tooling around with a dummied-out hammer and learned some more quirks about Hammerspace. Because of the weird effects of being out of bounds, gravity is far less restrictive for the player. This allows us to cross this gap without the need of a jump up pad. This level really shows off what the game can do when it comes to building levels around the no-clipping gimmick. You can tell that layouts like this room would be a cinch if the player had any of the guns that should have been available at the previous level, but trying to go through the intended path now would amount in a quick death. This dynamic causes the player to look at a given map much differently than they would as a conventional shooter. Wide open areas are killing fields. Closed off rooms are now more preferable spaces away from the enemy's line of sight. Hammer space also provides a new way of looking at a level. Because we can now see what's ahead of us by peeking through the walls, we can do recon and have more situational awareness than we ever would if we played this game the right way. The combat node in this room, adjacent to the enemy standing guard over the bridge, explains that going into hammer space resets the game's state. Any enemies that the player disables will revert to their normal state, and any keys that the player acquires will revert back to the enemy's possession, which provides a much needed restriction on the player's newfound ability. This game isn't about combat anymore, it's about solving puzzles. This comment says that even though going into hammer space may reset enemies and keys, jump pads will remain unlocked. This new rule gives the player some leeway into how to approach enemy encounters now. Running headlong into a fight is a guaranteed quick death, but popping in and out of bounds gives us the breathing room we need to pick off each soldier. Enemies are deliberately placed in such a way as to allow the player to flank them without taking damage, as they have a delay in attacking while shifting between alert phases, and if the player happens to take any damage, they can simply pop into hammer space and reset their health back to 100. The final level is more of the same, but the game is now pumping out the hardest butt rock to come out of 1997. It's really going full force into setting up those old titles, specifically Half-Life.
Rescued at last! Thank God you're here! Don't shoot! I'm with the science team! This is as far as I go.
These soldier models look and sound like the HECU enemies from Half-Life 1.
Roger that. Maintain lookout.
Once you cross this barrier, the game ends and provides a stat screen to show the player's overall performance. Hold up. 3 secret stars? Okay, I could only find 1 out of the 3. I know I saw one up here from a gameplay video where I learned about hammer space, but the devs might have moved it. Anyways, that's hammer space. It's a short game. It is the product of a game jam after all. But I think it's just the right length for this kind of premise. I won't be surprised if the devs consider expanding on this concept with more intricate levels, but I think that would run the risk of milking the concept dry. I like its premise. It's a send-up to game design and old school shooters that also delivers an interesting take on what should be considered a bug or a feature. Using dev cheats is usually associated with fooling around within a game and not being part of the game itself, so it's cool to see a game take that and turn it into a high concept like this. Definitely play Hammer Space. It's free on itch and just the right length to justify its premise.